for the Connect Commission for the new Royal Sussex Hospital in Brighton, I have the theme of the coast. And I was really pleased to get this. I've just moved to the coast myself, and it was an amazing opportunity to explore the coastline and get to know my own community, as opposed to often visiting somewhere that's really different. My name is Zoe Childerley. I'm a photographer and visual artist. I live in St Leonards-on-Sea, which is in East Sussex. I work with photography, but also drawing and mapping and text. I often travel quite far to work with different communities that are often quite rural and isolated. When I started working in America, landscape became much more integral to my practice. I was working in a very different landscape to ours, so the Rocky Mountains and then also the Californian desert. So I realised for those communities, the landscape had a really important impact on their sense of identity. Particularly in the American West, it's very tied up with ideas around freedom and exploration, conquering that landscape, which is very vast and awesome. So that's where I kind of really started to think about the ties between people's cultural identity, their sense of belonging, and the landscape around them. When I came back to work in the UK, I spent the last couple of years working on a project up in Northumberland and the Scottish borders, and I actually walked the length of the Scottish border, and that now has become an important part of my practice, walking in the landscape and having that quite physical experience and meeting people and coming across things that I perhaps wouldn't do otherwise. For the Connect Commission, I have the theme of coast. The reason I applied for this theme was I was really interested in some of the ideas around living by the sea, that kind of feeling of being on an edge and having that vast panorama on your doorstep, and how that affects people's kind of sense of well-being and identity as a coastal community. I've been walking the coastal path, so of all of Sussex, east and west. The work has a framework of 3 chapters: on the surface, at the edge, and beneath the waves. For example, on the surface, kind of where all the action happens, where the waves break, where the historical battles happened, where the trade happens, and see the freighters kind of across that line. Then thinking about beneath the surface, there's again something that I think lends itself very well to story, is that imagining what's beneath the surface. There's always been that crossover for when sort of early sailors exploring the oceans, you see on maps these kind of quite fantastical creatures illustrated because they were coming across things they weren't really familiar with. And that ties quite nicely also to some research I've come across on mapping the ocean floor. In the 60s, there's a woman called Mary Tharp developed some sonar mapping techniques to draw maps of the seabed floor before people were ever actually physically there, and it shows this hidden world of underlying hills and valleys and mountains, and that's part of my process to bring in my own sort of versions of mapping and mixing sort of the science and then the more sort of storytelling and mythological aspects. The At the Edge chapter is the more architectural physical buildings and sea defences, the sea walls and the groins, rock armour. So you've got anything from the Napoleonic Martello Towers, which are the circular buildings, and then you've got the later Second World War pillboxes, and then you've got the Art Deco architecture of the 20s, 30s, and then you've got the more contemporary sea walls and groins. So there's this correlation of all this architecture, all built for different purposes, but all sits along the coast. So I think in some ways the shoreline can be seen as the world's only true border, as in others being political fictions, but it's something that's quite dangerous, a sort of barrier between the known and the unknown, but then it's always moving and permeable, so it's quite a ethereal thing. I really hope that the work can offer something that feels like perhaps an escape or a distraction, and something that can be intriguing yet meditative, perhaps a window on an outside world, but then also a real connection to the place. The hospital itself is on the coast in Brighton, and people that use the hospital would be at least familiar with the coast in some shape or form, and so all the different areas that I'm exploring to do with conservation or industry or experiencing the sea in different ways, sort of offer insight into different perspectives around the coast, which hopefully will be kind of really engaging for people using the hospital and coming across the work.